The Triumph Speed Twin has always been up there with my favourite sporty retro bikes. The 1200cc Bonneville Parallel Twin is almost perfection with a beautiful soundtrack and bags of torque. The riding position is sporty enough but without being at all uncomfortable like a cafe racer with clip-ons, and it's a proper looker too. It's got those classic retro lines that have just been angled forward a touch for a hint of aggression. It really was already amongst the best of the retro motorcycle market. But what about this 2021 update? Have Triumph managed to make it even better, or have they failed miserably? And is it still amongst the creme de la creme of the modern classic scene? Well, today's the day I get to find out. So the big updates for the Speed Twin this year are twofold. It's the brakes and the suspension. Specifically with the suspension, it's the fork. You now get a Marzocchi 43mm upside down fork as opposed to the right way up fork of the previous gen. Now it ought to be more responsive, it ought to give a better ride, and it ought to improve the handling. And I have to say, it does feel absolutely excellent through these corners. No adjustability on this fork, you'll have to go up to the Thruxton RS for that, but most of us don't really need it. Woo! Speaking of the shocks, they're the same as the previous gen. Nothing fancy, they do the job, but not exactly the Öhlins of the Thruxton, but they have matched the settings to the fork, so everything's nice and balanced. Now the brakes have also had a decent bump in spec. Gone are the axially mounted 4-pop Brembo calipers in favour of some radially mounted monoblock Brembo M50s, so proper sports bike stuff. That radial mounting and monoblock construction should make the calipers themselves more rigid, so you ought to get more feel at the lever and better power. Now I wouldn't say it's night and day, but they do feel very strong indeed. There's not a particularly aggressive initial bite, but you only need 1 or 2 fingers to really haul this bike up. Perhaps more meaningful than that increase in power is the fact that the previous gen had a proper problem with squeaky brakes. Widely reported by a lot of owners, and I think the fact that these don't squeak is as much of a benefit as the boost in performance. Now I say 2 big improvements, but they have also made tweaks to the engine, so there's less inertia. It ought to rev up quicker on the throttle. They've found 3 more PS of peak power up at the top end. There's a boost in mid-range torque, and peak torque is also produced lower in the rev range. Now look, 3 PS right at the top of the rev range is not exactly the difference between a scooter and a Panigale, but given the option, I think we'd all take it. And I've got to say, this engine is still absolutely brilliant. More so than the peak power, it's just all that mid-range torque that makes it so usable. It's got that proper rip your arms out feel in sport mode, and it's an absolute hoot to ride. Honestly, around these back roads and country lanes, give me one of these any day over, I was gonna say any bike. Maybe. So it's pretty flipping good then, but it's not all progress on the spec sheet. I suppose the main drawback of this new version of the Speed Twin is the extra weight. Euro 5 emissions regulations mean that they've had to add to the exhaust system in order to get it to pass. So now you've not only got the catalyzer at the front under the belly of the bike, but also an extra one located in each silencer. 216 kilograms wet isn't exactly bad, but of course lighter is always better. Now I suppose one way around that is to fit some aftermarket pipes. Triumph don't do an official accessory anymore for this bike or many of their other bikes. They say they can't really add any performance given all the restrictions, and so it's not really particularly good value for money for the customer. If you can live with the extra weight though, I think they've done a great job of getting this bike to sound as good as possible. This bike here is the previous generation. It's got some parts from Renstall Moto, the tail section, the belly pan, but it's also fitted with a slash cut exhaust. I'll start each of them up and you can hear for yourself. Clearly the slash cuts are that little bit louder and they've got a nice bark to them too, but still, for a stock exhaust system, I'd say this sounds pretty good. Now I've got to say I wasn't 100% sold on the aesthetic straight away. Almost like they've gone too modern with it perhaps, with the upside down forks, the bigger Brembo brakes, different graphics on the tank, a new 12-spoke wheel design. But actually I think over the past week or two it's really grown on me, and I think there's some nice finishing touches here, such as the top yoke. It's got a more premium looking steerer nut on it, and the tops of the forks. Tiny touches like that do just elevate it in this stock form. Certainly the new forks and the brakes do add a bit of heft to the front end. They make it look a touch more aggressive. It's not a direct comparison because, as I say, there's plenty of custom work that's gone into this bike, but you can see that front end has a slightly more old school and retro look. Honestly, either one works for me. But is it still the top of the pile in 2021, or have things moved on a bit? Well, for me, this bike is still right in the sweet spot of what a retro motorcycle should be. You need the sound, the soul, and the stylishness of the bikes of yesteryear, and even with the slight modernizations, it still does that superbly. But of course, the reason you don't just buy a proper old bike is because you want the reliability, safety, and performance of a current day machine. And there's where Triumph have pushed it on still further. Specifically, the changes to the suspension and braking are a real success and bring it even closer to the Thruxton. Yet they haven't overspec'd it and made it unnecessarily complex or expensive. In fact, the price has only gone up by 300 quid this year, which is a snip for the upgrades you're getting. Yes, there are certainly some other great options out there on the market, but for me, this is the sporty retro motorcycle baseline standard against which all others ought to be measured. And for that reason, I'd highly recommend you demo this one first.